Good morning, everybody. I am going to tell you a little bit about what I know on the source filter theory. So, as the name suggests, the source filter theory has two major components. There is the source and the filter. So, in order to have speech, we need both. We can't have the glottal tone that is emitted at the phonation that occurs at the larynx, and we can't have that alone, and we can't have the filter alone because you can't filter a sound if you don't have a sound. So first, a little bit about phonation. It occurs at the vocal folds. As we know, the vocal folds is part of the larynx, are part of the larynx, and along with the thyroid cartilage, cricoid cartilage, hyoid bone, and epiglottis, but for voice we are really just concerned about the vocal folds. And the sound is actually produced at the vocal folds because air pressure from the lungs opens the glottis during each vibration, and the folds come together again because of the elasticity of the vocal folds. The elasticity also, the mass and elasticity also of the vocal folds also determine the pitch of the voice that is produced. So that quality of air pressure and elasticity, air pressure causing the vocal folds to open and elasticity closing them, creating a negative air pressure above the vocal folds, is known as the Bernoulli effect. So when all is said and done, we are given a fundamental frequency of the glottal tone from the vocal folds. So then what needs to happen to that tone in order to become speech? Because we know that this tone alone isn't speech, it has to go through the filter system, which is the vocal tract. So the vocal tract is made up of cavities and valves, as we know, and these, after phonation, the sound goes through the vocal tract and then sound goes through the vocal tract and becomes speech, and that the vocal tract changes in shape of these valves and cavities, and that is what changes the vibration of the airflow. So the first component of the vocal tract that I'll talk about is the air valves. These vocal tract valves regulate where the air flows. So the laryngeal valve is the vocal folds themselves, and then the velum regulates if after the pharyngeal cavity, if the sound goes through the nasal cavity or the oral cavity, and then the lingual valve is the tongue, and the labial valve are the lips, which we know are really important for articulation. So what we're really focusing on in the sound filter, in the source filter theory, are vocal tract resonators. And as we know, those are cavities. And we have three major ones: the pharyngeal, oral, and nasal. And we know as a whole that the vocal tract is a quarter wave resonator because it is open at one end and closed at the other. And so these cavities, as the definition of resonance right here states, is the tendency of a system to vibrate with the greatest amplitude in response to a frequency that matches or comes close to its own natural frequency. So the sound travels through these cavities, and then a formant is produced after the sound travels through the cavities, which we will talk about now. So resonator 1, F1, is the pharyngeal cavity. Pharyngeal cavity changes shape from neck constricting muscles. And so, as we know with like the pop bottle, glass bottle, or the wine bottle example that we used in class, the bigger the bottle is and you blow in it, the lower the pitch is going to be that it's produced. And so a constricted pharynx would make a smaller vocal tract and higher pitch, and then vice versa, open would be lower pitched. So after the air travels through the pharyngeal cavity, F2 is the oral cavity. So after the pharyngeal cavity, the air could either flow to the oral, which is F2, or the nasal, which is F3, and that the velopharyngeal valve that we talked about before regulates whether the sound goes to the oral or the nasal. So the oral cavity is also really important for articulation because it has all those major components, the tongue, teeth, palates, lips, everything that is important for articulation. So the F3 is the nasal cavity, and we know that most phonemes are produced in the oral cavity, but these are our three nasal phonemes. The sound, which I will talk about a little later. So once in the oral cavity, there's still not speech. We need articulation to produce specific phonemes, and articulation has three major components. There's the manner, or how the airflow is instructed, and this is going back to our phonetics class where we talked about stops, fricatives, affricates, nasals, liquids, glides, and then we know about place of articulation and voicing. So voicing is caused by the vocal cords held close together so that air passing through them makes them vibrate. And so a good example is f versus v. Can really tell that this F phoneme is unvoiced and the V is voiced. So when you're producing M, the sound, it is a nasal sound, as we mentioned. The place of articulation is bilabial. Use both your lips, and it is voiced. So I included a couple of sound spectrograms of the M being produced, and just as a recap, I think we all know that the x-axis on the sound spectrum is time, the y-axis is frequency, and the darkness is related to amplitude. So nasals involve a vocal tract constriction, and we know M is a nasal, right? And so the amplitude is lower than vowels, in part because the nasal membrane absorbs the sound. So in this, when ama is produced, you can see the A, and then this M right here is a lot lighter in color, and then another A. And then we can tell right from this big, huge white spot here that the M is lower frequency as well. Same thing over here, it's a lot lighter in color where that M is produced. Alright, now that I've gone over a little bit how the M is produced, we can compare it to a vowel. So when vowels are produced, the vocal tract is open. There's no constriction, and that means it's a lot easier to hold a vowel for a long period of time. And these four criteria of how a vowel is produced, we talk a lot about in phonetics. And so that we have height of the tongue, advancement of the tongue, tenseness, which is the degree of muscle activity and duration of the sound, and then lip configuration, which is either unrounded or rounded. So then we have the vowel quadrilateral here. And I picked the E sound, or the lowercase I, right there. So the height is high, the advancement is front, which you can tell from right here, it's high and front on the vowel quadrado. It's also tense and unrounded. So this is a cross-sectional image of the E being produced. And you can see on this little graph right here, the F1 right here is E has a low F1 and then a high F2. And so I was going to go a little bit into these graphs here. This isn't the E exactly, but it's a good example, and then I will take the information and apply it to these graphs. So we know this is called the source function graph, which is just the glottal tone. It's before any of the filters. And then the second one here is the transfer function. It is the resonant curves and the filtering of various filters. So this F1 of E, this is the average male voice. F1 of E happens at 280, right about there. F2, which we know is the oral cavity, happens at 2,620, and then F3 happens at 3380. And then this third graph over here represents actual output, or output function as we call it. And then I have another sound spectrogram of this time of E, and so x-axis is time and frequency. So you can tell E is a pretty high-pitched tone here. All right, I think that is what I have on the sound filter system. I hope you guys learned a little bit, and I hope you had a good time making your project. Thank you.